digital station on radio, TV and online. BBC Radio 4 Extra.
Now, our Omnibus edition of Radio 4's Book at Bedtime this week, which brings us 3 lost stories by the great F Scott Fitzgerald.
After his sensational start as a professional writer in 1919, F. Scott Fitzgerald was increasingly stereotyped as a writer of what he himself had dubbed the Jazz Age. Readers and editors anticipated from him standard romances, poor boys wooing rich girls, parties and glamour and glib flappers. When he tried something different, in a darker and deeper historical decade, and as a mature man who had lived through much pain, Fitzgerald found it very difficult to break out of this early stereotype. He wanted, as he put it, to open up a new well, a new vein. Unfortunately, only a very few appreciated what he was trying to do. These stories are about divorce and despair, working days and lonesome nights and sex, with marriage thereafter or not. Contemporary editors of popular mass-market magazines at the time were not Philistines, of course. However, there were good reasons for them to shy away from what Fitzgerald was writing by the mid-1930s. Some of the stories are dark and stark. Most of these stories are from the days when America and the world was in the Great Depression. Fitzgerald's fortunes, so high just a few years before, had fallen with the country's. After a breakdown in Europe in 1930, his wife Zelda was hospitalized in February 1932. For the rest of Fitzgerald's life and hers, Zelda would be in and out of costly private clinics and hospitals. The pressure Scott put on himself to earn enough money to pay for these was immense. From early 1935, Fitzgerald's own health was a concern to him too, and despite his fear of a recurrence of the tuberculosis with which he'd been diagnosed as a young man, he complicated matters by smoking and drinking to excess. Fitzgerald was deeply disappointed, for personal more than financial reasons, to have these stories rejected by editors wanting him to write jazz and fizz, beautiful cold girls and handsome yearning boys. He was a professional writer from his college days, laboring over draft after draft and regularly continuing to revise even after a story or book was published. His own copy of The Great Gatsby has changes and notations made in his hand that extend from the dedication page to those now epic concluding paragraphs. Fitzgerald wanted the hard work he put into writing his stories to be rewarded. He wanted these stories to be published. He tried to have them published. However, most of them come from a decade in his life when he no longer wanted to be edited. He preferred to let the stories lie in wait. The right time might have come during his lifetime if he had only lived longer. In Fitzgerald's writings from the first to the last, there continued to be humor both bright and dark, a fascination with beautiful people and places and all things, a delight in what the moonlight or dappled sunlight could do to a mood, and an affection for both his readers and his writing. Even when he despaired of ever regaining his popularity during his lifetime, Fitzgerald knew how good he was, and still could be, writing in the spring of 1940, "Once I believed I could, if I didn't always, make people happy, and it was more fun than anything. Now even that seems like a vaudevillian's cheap dream of heaven, a vast minstrel show in which one is the perpetual bones. But to die, so completely and unjustly after having given so much. Even now there is little published in American fiction that doesn't slightly bear my stamp. In a small way, I was an original." Through it all, through the difficulties and alcoholism and sickness, Fitzgerald kept on writing and trying to reflect what he knew and saw. The true Fitzgerald hallmark of these stories is their capacity for hoping.
Mrs. Hanson was a pretty, somewhat faded woman of 40 who sold corsets and girdles traveling out of Chicago. For many years, her territory had swung around through Toledo, Lima, Springfield, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Fort Wayne, and her transfer to the Iowa, Kansas, Missouri district was a promotion, for her firm was more strongly entrenched west of the Ohio. Eastward, however, she had known her clientele chattily, and was often offered a drink or a cigarette in the buyer's office after business was concluded. But she soon found that in her new district, things were different. Not only was she never asked if she would smoke, but several times her own inquiry as to whether anyone would mind was answered, half apologetically, with, "It's not that I mind, but it has a bad influence on the employees." "Oh, of course. I understand." Smoking meant a lot to her sometimes. She worked very hard, and it had some ability to rest and relax her psychologically. She was a widow, and she had no close relatives to write to in the evenings, while more than one moving picture a week hurt her eyes, so that smoking had come to be an important punctuation mark in the long sentence of a day on the road. The last week of her first trip on the new circuit found her in Kansas City. It was mid-August, and she felt somewhat lonely among all the new contacts of the past fortnight, and she was delighted to find at the outer desk of one firm a woman she had known in Chicago. She sat down before having herself announced, and in the course of the conversation found out a little about the man she was going to interview. "Will he mind if I smoke?" "What? My God, yes," said her friend. "He's given money to support the law against it." "Oh, well, I'm grateful for the advice. More than grateful." "You better watch it everywhere around here," her friend said, "especially with the men over 50. The ones that weren't in the war. A man once told me that nobody who was in the war would ever object to anyone smoking." But at her very next stop, Mrs. Hanson ran into the exception. He seemed such a pleasant young man, but his eyes fixed with so much fascination on the cigarette that she tapped on her thumbnail that she put it away. She was rewarded when he asked her to lunch, and during the hour she obtained a considerable order. Afterwards, he insisted on driving her to her next appointment, though she had intended to spot a hotel in the vicinity and take a few puffs in the washroom. It was one of those days full of waiting. Everyone was busy, was late, and it seemed that when they did appear, they were the sort of hatchet-faced men who did not like other people's self-indulgence, or they were women willingly or unwillingly committed to the ideas of these men. She hadn't smoked since breakfast, and she suddenly realized that was why she felt a vague dissatisfaction at the end of each call, no matter how successful it had been in a business way. Aloud, she would say, "We think we cover a different field. It's all rubber and canvas, of course, but we do manage to put them together in a different way. A 30% increase in national advertising in 1 year tells its own story." And to herself, she was thinking, if I could just get 3 puffs, I could sell old-fashioned whalebone. She had one more store to visit now, but her engagement was not for half an hour. That was just time to go to her hotel. But as there was no taxi in sight, she walked along the street, thinking, perhaps I ought to give up cigarettes. I'm getting to be a drug fiend. Before her, she saw the Catholic cathedral. It seemed very tall. Suddenly, she had an inspiration. If so much incense had gone up in the spires to God, a little smoke in the vestibule would make little difference. How could the good Lord care if a tired woman took a few puffs in the vestibule? Nevertheless, though she was not a Catholic. The thought offended her. It didn't seem so important whether she had her cigarette, because it might offend a lot of other people, too. Still, he wouldn't mind, she thought persistently. In his days, they hadn't even discovered tobacco. She went into the church. The vestibule was dark, and she felt for a match in the bag she carried, but there wasn't any. I'll go and get a light from one of their candles, she thought. The darkness of the nave was broken only by a splash of light in a corner. She walked up the aisle towards the white blur, and found that it was not made by candles, and in any case, it was going out soon. An old man was on the point of eliminating a last oil lamp. "These are votive offerings," he said. "We put them out at night. They float in the oil, and we think it means more to the people that give them to save them for next day than it would to keep them burning all night." "I see." He struck out the last one. There was no light left in the cathedral now, save an electric chandelier high overhead and the ever-burning lamp in front of the sacrament. "Good night," the sexton said. "Good night. I guess you came here to pray." "Yeah, I did." He went out into the sacristy. Mrs. Hanson knelt down and prayed. It had been a long time since she had prayed. She scarcely knew what to pray for, so she prayed for her employer and for the clients in Des Moines and Kansas City. When she had finished praying, she knelt up. She was not used to prayer. The image of the Madonna gazed down upon her from a niche 6 feet above her head. Vaguely, she regarded it. Then she got up from her knees and sank back wearily in the corner of the pew. In her imagination, the Virgin came down, like in the play The Miracle, and took her place and sold corsets and girdles for her, and was tired, just as she was. Then for a few minutes, Mrs. Hanson must have slept. She awoke at the realization that something had changed, and only gradually she perceived that there was a familiar scent that was not incense in the air, and that her fingers smarted. Then she realized that the cigarette she held in her hand was alight, was burning. Still too drowsy to think, she took a puff to keep the flame alive. Then she looked up again at the Madonna's vague niche in the half-darkness. "Thank you for the light," she said. That didn't seem quite enough. So she got down on her knees, the smoke twisting up from the cigarette between her fingers. "Thank you very much for the light," she said again.
The culmination of the tragedy took place on the great, wide, comfortable sofa, which was almost the oldest possession of their married life. "All right," said young Pauling, very serious and sad. "Let it go at that. We can't agree, and so we'd better separate. We've tried it for a year, and we've just played the devil with each other's lives." Carol nodded. "You mean you've played the devil with my life?" she amended. "No, I don't, but let it go at that. I'm not going to argue anymore. You don't love me, and the only thing I don't understand is why you didn't find it out before we were married. Now," Pauling hesitated, "when shall we actually... The night air of early May was cool in the room, and Carol crossed over gracefully and stood before the open fire. "I'd like to stay here till Mother gets back from Europe," she said. "Of course I can go tomorrow if you like, but I've no place special to go." "Don't think of going," said Pauling hastily. "Stay right here. I'll get out myself, first thing in the morning." "No, if that's the way you feel, I'll do the getting out. I just thought if it didn't annoy you to have me here." "Annoy me? Not a bit. Why—" He bit his lip. The whole reason for the separation was just that. Everything he did annoyed her terribly. He had given up the struggle to try to please her several weeks ago. "Of course you can stay here," he continued formally. "I'll move my junk out of the big room tonight. It's just for 2 weeks, you see." "Why, I'll be Again he broke off. He'd been about to say delighted, but he realized that it was not the right phrase. Nevertheless, it would have been somewhere near the truth. His mind clutched at the thought of her staying here, if only for a fortnight. The separation was necessary, of course, but this brief interval, when it was settled and yet not consummated, would make the parting less harsh and violent at the end. "Another thing," said his wife. "Two things. First, I've invited some people for dinner tomorrow night." "All right." "And second, about the servants. Esther and Hilda are leaving in the morning, and we'll have to have somebody until Mother comes home. So, I got a couple in town today." "Two, naturally." "No, I mean a couple. It's different. It's a man and his wife. She cooks, and he acts as butler and helps her with the housework. This couple look very good. He's English and she's Irish. I wouldn't have taken them at all if I'd been sure we were separating, but since they're coming—" Her voice faded off and her eyes focused on a spot in the center of the carpet. "Of course," muttered Pauling, looking at the same spot. He scarcely realized that she had stopped speaking and that there was silence in the room. He was thinking that in a few minutes he must go upstairs and, not in anger, but only with what dignity was left to him, take his things out of the big front room, his brush and comb, the little box with his studs and cuff buttons, the miscellaneous papers in his desk. Then, his marriage would be over. Something would happen during the night when they each lay in their separate rooms, which would destroy forever the slim, mysterious hold they had had on each other. The intangible and half-vanished marriage of their hearts that had kept them from splitting up long before. In the morning, they would each open their eyes upon a different world, conscious of having been apart and able to be apart forever. Pauling got to his feet. "I think I'll go up now," he said coolly. "All right. I'll lock the door." Half an hour later, he turned out the light in the guest room and slipped into bed. Outside, the May night, cool and clear, brought back the memory of another spring. A memory scratched and smeared in the recent months, but in itself still a lovely and idyllic thing. He wondered if love ever came again with that intensity, with that gay magic of first love, or if that was squandered now, and irrevocable forever. By and by he heard Carol moving about below. The light snapped and her footsteps fell on the stair. She walked very slowly as if she were tired, and when she reached the top she rested for a minute just at the threshold of his room. Then she went into the big front chamber and closed the door after her, and a heavy silence seemed to come in the window with the night air and settle through the house. In the morning, Pauling drove down to the station for the new servants, picking them out immediately from the crowd which disembarked from the 10 o'clock train. "Reynolds?" The man, a middle-aged Briton with a long neck and a bland Cockney face, nodded profusely. "Yes, sir. Reynolds." He turned to a large lady of Irish extraction who stood immediately behind him. "This is my wife, sir. Her name is Katie." It seemed that there was a trunk. Reynolds went to inquire about it while Pauling and the large lady engaged in conversation upon the station platform. That is, Pauling remarked that it was a short trip out, and Katie nodded her head up and down in genial vibration. "Been in this country long?" asked Pauling as they drove away from the station. Reynolds nodded. "Not very long." Katie disagreed. "Maybe 2 months." "Work in New York?" "No, we worked in Philadelphia. Oh, for some very fine gentlemen there. Maybe you know them. Mr. Marbleton and Mr. Shafter?" No, Pauling did not know them. He nodded understandingly, though, as if he knew how nice they must be. Arrived at the house, Pauling showed them the kitchen and hinted delicately that their rooms were just above. Then he left them to their own devices and strolled out on the front porch. It was his vacation this 3 weeks, the first in a year. It was convenient, of course, that his vacation should come now when the catastrophe of a divorce had overtaken him. Yet he wished, in a way, that he had work to do. The melancholy of the affair would be accentuated by his inactivity. He could only sit through the soft May weather, watching the days drift by that marked the ending of the unrepeatable adventure. He was glad, of course, that the last word had been said. Carol's arrogance, her coldness, her growing dislike for him had been beyond endurance. He was short-tempered himself, and many times in the last month their disputes had hovered on the verge of physical violence. "Lou?" He looked up to see her outside the porch screen in the bright sunshine. "Hello," he said, rising to let her in. "Your couple came all right. They're in the kitchen." "Thanks," she said coolly, stepping up on the porch, her arms full of flowers. "I'll go right back and see them." She was wearing, he noticed, a stiff, starched dress of palest blue that she had not worn since the summer before. He looked at her closely to find signs of sleeplessness around her eyes, as he knew there were around his own. But she was as fresh and pink as the flowers in her arms. "I've cut them for dinner," she said. "Aren't they lovely?" "Very." Without looking at him, she went into the house. They had luncheon at 1, and as he sat down, he told himself that this must be his last luncheon with her. He must find some way of passing the days in town. He had no taste for a series of meals eaten in silence with downcast eyes. Luncheon was scrappy and unappetizing. It would be, of course. The new couple had not had time to get used to the kitchen, but he wondered whether Reynolds' footsteps around the table were not unnaturally loud. "They're new," said Carol. "Everything's mixed up back there. It'll be different tonight." The dessert arrived. Sliced peaches in a sauce dish. "This is all right for now, Reynolds," said Carol. "But for tonight, of course, I want the dessert served from a bowl." "What, madam?" "I say I want the dessert served from a bowl, you know? The blancmange I told you about." Reynolds nodded comprehendingly. He hesitated. "Oh, and do you want me to cut the grass this afternoon?" Carol looked up in surprise. "Why, yes, if you will. That is, perhaps you'd better wait till tomorrow." "What?" "I say perhaps you'd better wait till tomorrow," said Carol in a slightly louder voice. "You'll be pretty busy this afternoon, you know." Reynolds nodded and clumped into the pantry. "He must be used to cutting the grass," said Carol. "That must be one of the duties couples have." And she added in a low voice, "He seems to be a little deaf. I guess that's why he's so noisy when he walks." Their guests that night were 3, the Harold Gays from Portchester, whom they knew only slightly, and Roderick Barker, an old beau of Carol's from New York. Pauling found himself wondering if Barker, now when Carol was free, would renew the courtship that his own had interrupted. He hoped not. Not Barker, at any rate. The idea of Carol going places with Barker, of flirting with Barker, kissing Barker, appalled him. With an effort, he drove the consideration from his mind. "How's Twine?" asked Barker. Twine was a minute poodle with scanty wool and the eyes of one far gone in drink, who was alternately dear and repugnant to Carol's heart. "Twine's great," she answered. "He almost bit the new butler today. Oh, I forgot to tell you we have a butler now. Aren't we grand?" "Well, this is absolutely the last word," exclaimed Barker enthusiastically. "He's only part of a couple," confessed Carol, "but he's straight from England, and you'll have to admit that's something." In a minute, the gentleman referred to appeared in the doorway and announced in a loud, sing-song voice, "Dinner is ready!" All eyes turned toward him. The tone of the interruption was somewhat startling, and everyone rose precipitately as if they had been summarily ordered from one room into the other. Carol made a mental note to speak to him about his voice tomorrow. "I'm going to send him out and have it lowered," she remarked, with an insincere facetiousness as they strolled in. "Charming," murmured Barker, smiling. A dozen times during dinner remarks were made, careless, casual things that made Pauling aware that everything was changed. Someone's divorce was discussed in detail, what she had said and how cruel he had been. A recital which included the details as to who the parties to the divorce were going with now. "They say you two set an extraordinary example in Rye," said Mrs. Gay genially. "You're the only known couple who never quarrel in public under any conditions." "That's the most dangerous kind," remarked Barker. "It means they quarrel at home. It's a vice like secret drinking. If married people don't quarrel in public, it's because they can't get the full flavor of brutality out of it unless they're alone." Pauling and Carol were both red as fire. The other three seemed to guess that something inept had been said, and the subject shifted uneasily to golf. The roast had been served according to Carol's instructions, already carved in the kitchen, and as dinner progressed, she rang the bell for the second serving. Dreading Reynolds' resounding, "What?" she caught his eye and nodded at her own plate. He nodded back, and before she realized what he was doing, he snatched it up and disappeared into the pantry. Carol saw Mrs. Gay's eyes fall curiously upon her empty place. Then the pantry door burst open and Reynolds stamped eagerly in. He was bringing back her plate. He had heaped it with roast and vegetables, and he set it down with a sort of flourish before her, as if to say, "There, look what I did for you." There was no hoping that this would pass unnoticed. Carol was pink with embarrassment, and her ears were privy to a short, repressed snicker to which each of the three men contributed a part. "Serve everything again, Reynolds," she said impatiently. "What?" He craned his long neck. His mouth was ajar in polite inquiry. "Serve everything again?" Her one thought now was to get through dinner with as little emphasis as possible upon the service. Luckily or unluckily, Reynolds was excited now at his former blunder and determined at this point to make up for it by seeing that everyone had enough to eat. "What?" he remarked to Mrs. Gay. "No asparagus?" The irrepressible and, to Carol, faintly ghastly laughter which ensued fell inaudibly upon his ears. The man was apparently deaf as a post. Clump, clump, clump went his footsteps, interrupting the conversation, giving the impression somehow that pans were clanking and hammering was going on and china was continually crashing on the floor. After luncheon, Carol had explained to him in detail about the dessert. He must take a dessert plate, she said, and on it place a doily and a finger bowl. The person served would himself remove the doily and the finger bowl. All this had become very confused in Reynolds' mind. He knew how the plate and doily and finger bowl should look upon the table, and he had a confused impression that something was going to be removed. How, or why, he did not know. But he was a resourceful man. Just when the conversation had regained a certain animation, he entered with the blancmange, advanced upon Carol, and after a moment's hesitation, reached down and snatched away her finger bowl. Then, before she realized his intention, he had spooned a large order of blancmange onto the linen doily. Without tarrying, he stamped around to Barker and repeated the performance. Mrs. Gay, with great presence of mind, managed to remove the doily from her plate. The others gazed down in awe upon the vision of a wet linen dessert. "If anyone wants any more," said Reynolds to his mistress in a confidential shout, "there's a lot of this in the kitchen." The time was so short, 12 days now, that they decided next morning not to let the couple go. Once the dinner guests had departed, it seemed to Pauling a vastly unimportant matter in comparison with the imminence of their separation. Pauling went up to town early and spent the day at the Yale Club, feeling out of place amongst the younger men there, feeling older even than his classmates, and already a little smirched in the light of his coming divorce. He looked forward in a way to his freedom. He could read and travel more. He would be away from the pressure of Carol's high-strung, nervous temperament. But he could never be a bachelor again in quite the same way. When evening came, he saw no reason why he should go back to the country. But as the time drew near for the last afternoon train, he knew he would go. The notion of Carol alone in the house with two strange servants made him uneasy. His presentiment was justified. As he let himself in, he saw her sitting on the sofa with twine in her lap, staring straight in front of her with angry eyes. "You'll have to let these people go," she said immediately. "They're awful." "Why? What have they done now?" "Well, in the first place, they gave me an awful lunch, and when I went in the kitchen and started to complain, that woman gave me an awful look, as if she was going to bang me over the head with a saucepan. The man's even worse." "I'll speak to them." "Something else, too. They whipped Twine." "Whipped Twine?" he asked incredulously. "What for?" "Nothing. They said he bit the man, but if he did, they must have started it, because Twine never bites anybody." "What did you do?" "I was afraid to do anything. That woman kept muttering around so, and Reynolds was stamping up and down in the kitchen as if he'd been attacked by a grizzly bear. I picked up Twine and walked right in here, and I've been in here ever since." Ejaculated Pauling. "I'll fire them right after dinner." Dinner was uneatable. Carol sat with her elbows on the table and her face in her hands and shook her head curtly whenever a dish was offered her. When dinner was over, Pauling pushed open the pantry door. "Reynolds," he called. As if he'd been waiting for the call, Reynolds burst out of the kitchen with aggressive alacrity. "Reynolds, I'm afraid we don't suit each other, and we'd better not try it any longer." Reynolds looked at him blankly. "I said," repeated Pauling, "that perhaps we don't suit each other, and we better not try this any longer." Reynolds nodded. "Oh, you suit us all right," he announced, craning his long neck and looking down fatuously at Pauling. "But you don't suit us," went on Pauling impatiently, "and I think we'd better—" "Why don't we suit you?" "Because we want an experienced butler. We're paying you a big salary, and we want someone who's trained." "They can't even make the beds," said Carol. She had come into the dining room and was standing at his elbow. "I looked at mine this afternoon, and it was just pulled back. Nothing but wrinkles. I had to make it all over again." Reynolds had been glaring at them with an outraged expression in his pale eyes. "I've never failed to give satisfaction before," he burst out. "When we were with those two gentlemen in Philadelphia, they couldn't do enough for us." His tone implied that the two gentlemen in Philadelphia had bathed them in tender emotion. "I'm John Bull himself, I am," he went on defiantly. "Why doesn't your lady there tell me when I do wrong instead of raising all this trouble?" "Because this isn't a training school," shouted Pauling. "You're supposed to be an efficient butler when you come here." Reynolds took refuge behind his previous statement. "I've never had any complaints before." "The food's no good," shouted Carol. What? He looked at her incredulously. Why, my wife and I ran a restaurant in England for 10 years. Look here, I don't want to argue about this, cried Pauling. Your way of serving and cooking may be all right, but it isn't our way, and that's all there is to it. So, good night. They came back to the living room. Why didn't you tell them to get out tomorrow? Demanded Carol. I didn't have the heart. This is evidently their second job in America, and it'll take a couple of hours to get it through his noodle that he's fired. Carol took a moving picture magazine from the table and went upstairs. A few minutes later, clumping violently, Reynolds came into the living room. Well, asked Pauling, what can I do for you? I'd like to ask you for a recommendation. A recommendation? Why, you've only been here 3 days. Yes, Reynolds agreed, but we came all the way from Philadelphia. What's that got to do with it? Oblivious to this question, Reynolds continued. You see, we've only got one recommendation, and it's awfully hard to get a position unless you've got two. Well, said Pauling hesitantly, I suppose I can write you out something. He went to the desk in the corner. What did you do before you were a butler? He shouted. Oh, we kept a restaurant, and then I was a postman in Devonshire. Pauling began writing. Listen, he said in a moment. I'll read it to you. To whom it may concern, this is to certify that James Reynolds and his wife have been in my employ and have shown themselves to be willing and honest. He has been a letter carrier and also had experience as a restaurant man and a butler. How does that suit you? I'm afraid I can't say anything more. Reynolds read over the letter, folded it slowly. And so you want to give me my month's notice? He remarked. Month's notice? Cried Pauling. I want you to get out Saturday. Reynolds considered with deep melancholy. Very good, he said reluctantly. You pay me my month's wages and we'll get out. I'll give you 2 weeks' wages. Why, you've only been here 3 days. Pauling reached up and plucked the letter of recommendation from Reynolds' hand. I'm not going to give you this, he said, if you argue any more. He felt a sort of pity toward the man and his incompetent helplessness, but when, in the morning, the argument was resumed, he lost patience. Pauling had his coat on and was starting for New York. See here, he said, you can't argue me into changing my mind. If you've got anything to say, you'd better take it up with Mrs. Pauling. Paying no attention to Reynolds' importunate, wait a minute, Pauling put his hat on and hurried out the door. He was glad when the week was over. After breakfast on Saturday, he opened the pantry door and called Reynolds into the dining room. I want to pay you your money whenever you're ready. Reynolds waved his hand airily. Oh, you can wait until the day we go. The day you go? Exclaimed Pauling. This is the day you go. Mrs. Pauling said we could stay till Wednesday. The pantry door had opened half a foot, and from the aperture 2 angry black eyes were regarding Pauling over Reynolds' shoulder. That's what she said, spoke up Katie menacingly. I talked to her myself. When Carol came downstairs, Pauling approached her incredulously. Did you tell them they could stay till Wednesday? She hesitated. Yes, I did. Why? That woman, that Katie, she said unevenly. She came upstairs the other day after you went to town and made me. Made you? How could she? She was all excited and talking loudly, and Reynolds was stamping up and down the hall like the British Army, so I got afraid and I told them they could stay till Wednesday. Besides, I was sorry for them. She said they had no place to go. That afternoon, fatigued with the sleeplessness of 3 nights, Pauling lay down on the porch settee and dropped off into a hot doze. The hours slipped away, scarred with fretful dreams. At 5, He awoke suddenly to find Carol standing over him, sobbing out something in a terrified voice. "What's the matter?" he muttered, starting up.
"It's Twine," she cried. "They've killed him. I knew they would. He's been missing since this morning, and I just saw a revolver on the kitchen table."
Pauling jumped to his feet. "Are you sure?"
"Positive. I heard the shot half an hour ago and a sort of yelp. Oh, to kill a poor, helpless little dog."
"Wait right here," said Pauling.
"He'll shoot you," cried Carol. "If I were you, I wouldn't go in there without your pistol."
He found Katie alone in the kitchen, involved in a mass of dough which covered her large, muscular arms to the elbow. "Where's Reynolds?" he asked abruptly. She shrugged her shoulders heavily.
"Hasn't he got the right to go out and walk once in a while?"
This was a checkmate. Pauling's eyes roved quickly around the kitchen. "Have you seen the dog?" he demanded in a more casual voice. Katie's eyes followed his around the room.
"Yes, I've seen the dog. He's in and out here all the time. I don't like dogs," she added ominously.
"My wife wants to know where the dog is."
"I didn't go into service in order to watch over a dog," she answered. "It's bad enough to have the smelly beast in the kitchen." "It isn't smelly. It's smelly," said Katie definitely.
Again, the conversation seemed to have reached an impasse. He tried a new tack. "My wife tells me she saw a revolver in the kitchen." Katie nodded unconcernedly.
"It belongs to Mr. Reynolds. He was cleaning it."
At this point, the kitchen door opened and Reynolds came in. From his hand dangled a leather thong which Pauling instantly recognized as Twine's lead rope. "Where have you been?" he demanded.
"Did what?"
asked Reynolds.
I say, where have you been?"
"I've been walking," said Reynolds calmly, tossing the lead onto the kitchen table.
"What are you doing with that?"
Pauling pointed to the table.
"That? Oh, that's for the dog. I was going to take the thing for a walk. I wasn't able to find it."
Pauling wondered what this meant. If he had killed Twine in the yard, he would scarcely have used the lead. "What were you doing with a revolver?" Reynolds' neck elongated with indignation.
"I'll carry a revolver any time I want to."
"And what do you think of that?"
"I think you're an idiot,"
answered Pauling hotly. Reynolds stepped forward suddenly and laid his hand on Pauling's shoulder.
"Look here, Pauling,"
he began, but got no further.
"Watch out," cried Pauling. "At present, you're taking my money as a servant, and you keep your hands to yourself. You're going out of this house in the morning."
"I may be a servant," bleated Reynolds, "but I'm John Bull himself." Pauling was torn between anger at the man's stupidity and amusement at his identification of himself with the British Empire.
"I've worked in better places than this," went on Reynolds. "Why, those two gentlemen in Philadelphia, they couldn't do enough for us," shouted his wife.
Pauling rushed wildly from the kitchen. Outdoors, he spent an hour combing the neighborhood for a newly made grave, but he was unable to find any trace of Twine. He searched his own yard next and every cranny of the garage. It was no use. Twine had effectually disappeared. They had dinner at the golf club, very coldly and formally. And when they got home, Carol went upstairs to begin her packing. He knew miserably that in her heart she blamed him for the loss of her dog, too, as though it were some last revenge he was taking on her for leaving him. In his dreams that night, he saw Reynolds set down Twine. Twine cooked à la maître d'hôtel before Carol's mother on the Mauritania.
"I'm John Bull himself,"
said Reynolds, as he covered the steaming dog with thick gravy.
"Good,"
answered Carol's mother.
"I'm going back to take my daughter away."
"Fine," said Reynolds. "I'll introduce your daughter to those two gentlemen in Philadelphia. Pauling awoke, his body jerking nervously upright. The knob of his door had turned slightly. The door pushed slowly open. "Lou!" It was Carol's voice in a frightened whisper. "There's someone downstairs." Pauling got out of bed and, slipping quickly into his dressing gown, joined her in the hall. "I think it's Reynolds," she whispered. "Hello," he muttered, looking down the stairs. "He's got the light on." Pistol in hand, he descended the steps softly and put his head around the corner of the living room. Reynolds, luxuriously attired in a flowered dressing gown, was kneeling before the desk. The desk drawers were open, and the floor was littered with the paper they had contained. He was not alone. Katie, also in a negligee, was moving about the room, looking into jars and cigar boxes, behind books, and along the mantelpiece with eager, penetrating eyes. From time to time, they exchanged a look, and both shook their heads in unison, as if so far their search had yielded nothing of value. Pauling stepped briskly into the room. "Hands up!" he commanded, leveling the revolver at Reynolds. The man was so startled that, letting go his hold upon the desk, he fell into a sitting position on the floor. With a little cry, Katie raised her hands toward the ceiling. "What's the idea?" asked Pauling. Reynolds looked dumbly at his wife. "We're poor people," she cried in a scared voice. "You're dishonest people," snapped Pauling. "What's more, you're going to jail." "Oh, no!" Katie burst into tears. We never done any harm." "Just having some innocent fun, huh?" "We had to do it," cried Katie. "We're in America and we've got to live. I persuaded him into it. Honestly, I did, sir." Reynolds' mouth moved convulsively. "You had it and we wanted it, that's all," he said. "There's no harm done," repeated Katie tearfully. "It wasn't any good to you. We didn't think you'd mind." "Not mind?" exclaimed Pauling. "Oh, good heavens," sobbed Katie. "If only you'd given it to us, this wouldn't have happened." "Why should I give you my money?" Reynolds and Katie exchanged a look. "We don't want your money," said Reynolds with dignity. "Accept what you owe us. I'm looking for my letter of recommendation. I consider it by rights my property." Pauling lowered his gun slowly. "Do you mean to say that's what you came here for at this time of night?" "Yes, sir," admitted Katie. Reynolds got up stiffly from the floor. "I'm John Bull himself," he said irrelevantly. "Well, you go and be John Bull in your own bedroom. I ought to have you both arrested." "It's just trouble ever since we came here," wept Katie. "I'm sure Mr. Reynolds and I aren't responsible. It's Mrs. Pauling that makes all the trouble. She just lies around all day and keeps a crying and carrying on as if something was breaking her heart." "What?" Pauling was so astonished that the gun missed his pocket and tumbled to the floor. "And how does she think I can get the wrinkles out of the sheets," went on Katie, "when she tosses around all night long until it's a wonder she doesn't wear them out entirely?" "My God!" cried Pauling. Are you telling me the truth?" "The truth? Why should I lie?" "Make yourself at home," he broke out wildly. "Cigars on the table. Stay here all night." Turning, he rushed ecstatically from the living room and up the stairs two at a time. "Carol!" he called. "Oh, Carol!" She was waiting on the top landing, and she came down 2 steps to meet him. They melted together in the great square of silver which came in the open window, fresh from the full moon. At 10 o'clock the next morning, Mr. Reynolds, swathed in a brilliant blue ulster, appeared in the living room with Mrs. Reynolds by his side. When they came in, they both bent a somewhat supercilious glance upon the plain morning clothes which the Paulings had seen fit to put on. "We are now leaving," announced Reynolds. "We have a taxi for the 10:30 train. It's a very wet day." Pauling went to his desk and, after some rummaging around among last night's disarranged papers, discovered his checkbook. "And as man to man," added Reynolds, sniffing a little, "I want to ask you if you will kindly give us our recommendation." When Pauling had written the check, he reached in his coat pocket and, pulling out a paper, examined it with a frown. "I forgot to sign it," he said suddenly. He bent over it with the pen. Then, folding it around the check, he handed it to Reynolds. Nodding and smiling pleasantly, Katie opened the door. "Goodbye," said Pauling. "I wish you luck." "Goodbye," called Carol cheerfully. "Goodbye, sir. Goodbye, madam." Reynolds paused with his hand on the open door. "My only hope for you both is that if you find yourself in a strange country, you'll never be turned out into the cold on a day like this." His effect was somewhat spoiled by the fact that the sun chose this very moment to appear. Nevertheless, Reynolds turned up his coat collar dramatically and, pushing his wife before him, walked out into what he evidently imagined to be a raging storm. "Why, they're gone," said Pauling, shutting the door and turning round. "They're gone, and we're alone in the house." She held out her arms, and he went over and knelt down beside her. "One thing," she said after a long while. "What did you do to that letter of recommendation? I saw you write something on it besides your name." "I just changed one word." He began to laugh, a little at first, and then hilariously, until it became infectious, and she laughed too. "I gave them a check for $200, he said, "but I'm afraid they'll never be able to use that letter." "What did you change?" she demanded. "Why, there was a line in it that says he was a letter carrier. I changed the word letter to the word typhoid." "A typhoid carrier?" she repeated, puzzled. Then she understood, and suddenly they both began to laugh again, happily and irrepressibly. Laughter that floated upstairs and into the bedrooms and baths and curled around through the dining room into the pantry and back again to where they sat. The whole house was full of sunshine now, and as the fresh breeze blew the garden odors in at the window, life seemed to begin all over again, as life has a way of doing. At 12 o'clock noon, a small, baldish poodle, with the eyes of one far gone in drink, might have been seen rounding a corner and approaching the Pauling house. Traversing a wide, suspicious circle, he approached the front door, where he announced his presence with a discreet cough. It was some time before he was able to obtain any attention. He had been noticing the drift of things, and he feared for a moment that the place was deserted. But he was wrong. One couple, the couple he dreaded, had gone away. But there was still another couple in the house.
Each time George Lawson Dewberry came down to visit his father in Cuba, the same thing happened. George's mail arrived before he did, and his father, whose name was Lawson Dewberry, slit open the first letter and read "Dear George" before he realized that it was not for him. Always then, he literally shut his eyes as he slipped it back in the envelope, and when later he gave the letter to his son, wore a guilty expression as he explained how it happened. What Lawson afterwards referred to as the letter arrived in his offices at the Pan American Refining Company on a hot day in July. Perhaps it was the sweat on his glasses. Perhaps it was the letter's ambiguous beginning, "Greetings, old boy," which made Lawson read the first few pages before recognizing the advance guard of his son's correspondence. After that, he had to go right through to the end. George was 18, a sophomore. George's mother was dead, and Lawson had worked hard and clumsily at the mother and father role until George managed to flop into Yale, in the manner of an exhausted game fish flopping into a boat, causing Lawson to hope that the worst was over. The letter, postmarked Paris, was from George's roommate, Wardman Evans. After one reading, Lawson went to the door and said to his secretary, "No phones for an hour." Returning to his desk, he read the letter a second time. June 30th, 1939. Well, she gave in on the boat, and I don't mind telling you I was scared about being the first. The worst of it was, she suddenly took it all so seriously, and I had an awful time shaking her off in Paris. She's 17 and in college, and if it hadn't been me, it would have been somebody else. How did it go with Elsie? Did you G the L? Or is she still pulling that one about being a Catholic and doesn't believe in birth control? Get 'em young is my theory, and at least you won't run into anything like I did last April. When you write, tell me about Sweet 16. We can compare some juicy notes if she went through with it. I meant to tell you that the doctor said before I left God's country that I'm okay. But after a week in this crazy burg, well, I'm more worried about myself than I am about Lucy. Ever yours, Wardman. Roomy. Lawson Dewberry could have sworn that no hour had elapsed before his secretary opened the click latch and assured him it had. Could you bring me in a typewriter? I want to pound out a letter myself. He felt very much alone. There was no man with whom he cared to discuss this, most certainly not with George. He had another plan. On the typewriter, slowly and painstakingly, he wrote a letter to Wardman Evans. He began by explaining how he had happened to open the letter. Then he descended swiftly into blackmail. If you will remember its details, you will understand that I can't pass it on to my son, and that I don't think it's best for you two to room together next year. This implies no criticism of you, nor any suggestion that you have been a bad influence. Perhaps it's the reverse. I count on you, as the elder, to immediately notify the Yale registrar and my son of the change of plan about the room, inventing any excuse you want. No doubt you will prefer such an extremely intimate and revealing letter returned. So at the same time that you send me a copy of your letter to the registrar, send me also an address where you would like it mailed. Yours, not without sympathy, but thoroughly disturbed and entirely determined, Lawson Dewberry. As he waited for the plane at the customs dock, he kept thinking that there was nothing in the letter which convicted George and Sweet 16. He winced at even thinking the girl's name. "Father, you look fine." Relief stole over Lawson. This healthy, generous, jovial specimen simply couldn't think in the manner of that letter. Lawson strutted with him from the dock. At the end of the first week, George dropped the name Wardman Evans while they were at luncheon at Al Patio. It seemed to fall like a live grenade in Lawson's plate. "He and I have the same sense of humor," George said. "That's one reason I like rooming with him." "He impressed me as rather ordinary," said Lawson evenly. There was mail for George in Wardman's handwriting from here and there in Europe. And there were girls' letters, in many handwritings which Lawson read in his imagination. They were all signed by Elsie, all saying, "George, help me. What have we done?" But in the mornings, Lawson could be modern enough to think, this isn't 1890, and it takes two to make a seduction. Somewhat along this line, George first displayed his ethical equipment. "I'm steering clear of Philadelphia when I go back. My God, when a girl has a yen for a man, she'll go to any lengths. The old mousetrap play. Why don't they go after men in a position to marry? That's later. I'm talking about sex, which I hope doesn't shock you. It still goes on, you know." "Lay low," Lawson whispered to himself, remembering only that George must be separated from Wardman, and that if George was brutally predatory, he must be slowed up this side of disaster to himself and Sweet 16. So the weeks passed, with George making him both young and old. Then letters came. Lawson's envelope, posted from London, contained a carbon of a letter to the registrar. It informed him that he, Wardman Evans, would not be rooming with George Dewberry next term. But the reason it gave was, "Since I am resigning from the university and have so informed the dean." At the bottom was an addenda in pen and ink. "I hope this will please you. I am not enclosing a copy of my letter to George because a man does not have to take orders from anyone except his own father or employer. But I assure you, in case you plan to accidentally open it, that it does not mention your letter in any way, shape, or form. Yours truly, G. Wardman Evans." There was a letter for George in the same handwriting, but George was on a 2-day business trip to Pinar del Rio, and Lawson could only spend a bad weekend reading over Wardman's letter to George and his own letter to Wardman, wondering if he could have forced the young man to such an extreme. George, coming into the office on Monday, pocketed the letter addressed to him and talked of Pinar del Rio and his desire to work in Cuba until college opened. But later that afternoon, when they met at Lawson's club, George was in a state of profound gloom. "That fool Wardman." "What's he done?" "Quit college," said George aghast. "Of all the insane things." "Why'd he quit?" "He seems to have married a little trollop named Lucy Bigmaster." Lawson called a passing waiter and ordered a double whiskey. George took a beer. "Why did he marry her?" Lawson asked. "That's the mystery." "Maybe he had to." "Don't make me laugh. I've known Lucy 3 years. I know her character, and my guess is he must have been tight." "Aren't you jumping at conclusions about the girl?" said Lawson coldly. "Lacking evidence to the contrary, can't you presume that a girl of 17... He stopped himself at George's puzzled look. "How do you know she's a girl of 17? I don't remember mentioning her." Taking down his drink, Lawson ordered another. "He mentions you in the letter," George said. Lawson's heart jumped. "He sends his regards, and he hopes you'll be a good influence on me." "Let's forget it all," said Lawson. "I'm sorry because you're sorry, but he was a fool, as you say, giving up his education for a girl. He was trapped." "I don't know the girl," said Lawson. "Speaking impersonally, I only hoped she isn't trapped too." He was tempted to snatch one more drink on the way out, but that would have violated his rules. Then, due to the slight frustration involved, he made another slip. Maybe Wardman isn't such a prize physical package himself. Stepping out of the club into the blinding sunlight, Lawson felt triumphant and talkative. He was glad for the sake of discretion that George and he weren't spending the evening together. Later, he stopped for a nightcap at a bar where young girls waited on the customers. On departing, he tipped his hat in the Latin manner. "Multa gratia, Lucy," he said jovially, and then to the other barmaid, Adios, Elsie. He tipped his hat again and bowed. And as he walked out, left the two girls staring, unaware of that he had bowed across 2 generations into an American past. The feeling of triumph persisted into the next morning, when he entered his office late and full of new hopes for his son and himself. George was not yet in, but on the desk was an envelope in his handwriting marked "Personal." Lawson opened and read it. Then, as upon another occasion, he rang for his secretary and said, "Please, no phones." Then he read it a second time. "I guessed from your last remark that there was something phony going on. I worried about it all night, and this morning your secretary handed me a letter which she said must have got into your files by mistake. Attached to it was your answer, and I'm not even pretending that it was an accident that I read that too. By the time you get this, I will be on the clipper. The cashier advanced the wages due me. In saying goodbye, I want to state I have tried to be a good son and act like a gentleman, as far as I understand what the word means." Not till weeks later, when he saw a newspaper item about George's marriage, the ceremony was performed in Elkton, Maryland. Miss Elsie Johnson, the bride, is 16 years old. Did Lawson realize that, in the welter of good intentions, that doubtful quantity Elsie had been saved? But the sacrifice was his son's. He was never quite able to realize how he could have acted otherwise. But at certain times thereafter, he would remark upon modern young women and their ways. His kindest comment was that they were the only hunters desperate enough to bait a trap with crushed and broken portions of themselves. And he would qualify even this with, "It's not their own courage, it's the courage of nature." There were other things that he caught himself saying which cannot be set down. Wardman Evans, among others, might have been honestly shocked to hear them.
The Lost Stories of F Scott Fitzgerald were Thank You for the Light, read by Karen Bartke, The Couple, read by Den Hertog, and Salute to Lucy and Elsie, read by Stuart Milligan. The producer was Ailey Macready.